Freezing, trembling, barely standing, she begged him not to turn her away, and the woman he sheltered that night changed everything he thought he knew about living alone. His name was Cal Danner. The year was 1881 in the high desert of New Mexico territory. He'd been ranching alone for 2 years since burying his wife and daughter. He had no intention of letting anyone through that gate, but she was already at it, soaked to the bone, the storm howling behind her like something alive. Watch this one to the end, because this is a story about two people who had both given up, and what happens when the world throws them together in the dark. Like and subscribe if you're new here. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Cal Danner bought the spread outside the town of Cimarron in the summer of 1878, when he and his wife Clara were young enough to believe that hard work and love in equal measure could build something worth passing down. The land was rough, high plateau country, thick with juniper and pinyon cut through by a creek that ran cold and clear from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. In winter, the wind came down from those peaks with a violence that bent the tallest trees. In summer, the thunderstorms rolled across the flatlands and turned the arroyos into rivers in under an hour. It was not easy country, but it was theirs. He'd built the main house board by board over a single summer, Clara measuring and cutting beside him, her hair pinned up under a sun-bleached hat. They'd planted a kitchen garden on the south side and fenced a good acre for the horses. By the fall of 1879, they had a working ranch, a small herd, and a daughter named May, who'd arrived in February of that year with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Then the fever came. It moved through Cimarron the way those summer storms moved through the arroyos, fast, total, and indifferent to whatever stood in its way. May went first, on a Tuesday night in October. Clara followed 3 days later, on a Friday morning, just as the sun was coming up. Cal buried them both on the ridge above the house, where the view of the mountains was clearest, and then he came back down and kept ranching because he didn't know what else to do. He let the kitchen garden go to weeds. He kept the horses, kept the fence, kept doing the daily work of the place out of habit more than hope. He stopped going into Cimarron, except when he needed flour or nails or something else he couldn't make himself. He stopped talking much. He owned 400 acres and a working well and a sound house, and he had never in his life felt so poor. By the fall of 1881, he had 6 horses he was breaking for sale, a small herd of cattle that required daily moving between pastures, and a reputation in town as a man who'd been touched by grief, which was what the good people of Cimarron said when they meant a man had turned too quiet. He ate the same 3 meals on rotation, kept his rifle by the door out of long habit, and went to bed early because the nights were easier when he was unconscious. He was not waiting for anything to change. He'd stopped doing that. The storm that struck the night of October the 14th came down out of the mountains without much warning. The barometer dropped hard through the afternoon. By evening, the sky over the Sangres had gone the color of a bruise. Cal spent 2 hours getting the horses into the paddock and checking the barn's roof bracing before the first gusts hit. By 9 o'clock, the wind was driving rain sideways and the temperature had fallen 20 degrees. He went inside, built up the fire, and figured he'd see how much roof he still had in the morning. He heard something at the gate near 10. At first he thought it was one of the horses moving around in the dark, pushing against the paddock fence. Then he heard it again, a sound that wasn't wind. He took the lantern and his rifle and went to the door and opened it, squinting out through the driving rain. She was holding onto the gatepost with both hands. She was small, younger than he'd first taken her for in the bad light, and she was soaked through to the skin. Her hair hung in dark ropes against her face. Her dress, a rough cloth garment belted with a woven cord, was plastered flat against her. She was shaking in a way that told him she'd been outside a long time. She met his eyes through the rain, and she said something in a language he didn't know, and then she switched to English, 3 words flat and direct. "I am cold." That was all. No pleading in it, no performance. Just a statement of fact from someone who was past the point of performing anything. Cal stood there for a moment. He thought about the fact that she was Apache, which was plain enough in her features and her dress, and that there were men in Cimarron who'd have told him to send her back into the storm. He thought about Clara. He thought about the last 2 years. He looked at the woman hanging onto the gate in the October dark, shaking so hard she was losing her grip on the post. He crossed the yard, unlatched the gate, and held it open. She let go of the post and walked through. She was limping on her left foot. He didn't ask about that. He said, "There's a fire inside," and he walked back toward the house and she followed him. He hung her wet things by the fire and gave her his spare wool blanket and a bowl of the beef stew he'd made that afternoon. She sat on the floor close to the hearth and ate. He noticed she had a knife at her belt, a bone-handled thing with a worn blade. She didn't take it off. He didn't comment on it. He set his rifle against the wall on the far side of the room, well away from his chair, and sat down and let her eat in peace. She finished the stew and set the bowl down with both hands, carefully, the way people do when they've been taught that objects have value and carelessness is disrespectful. She looked at him. The firelight caught her face, and he saw that she was not as young as he'd first thought. Mid-20s, maybe. She had high cheekbones and dark eyes that were watching him with the kind of steadiness that either meant calm or that she was very good at hiding fear. He guessed both. "My name is Cal Danner," he said. "This is my ranch. Naltsos Busy," she said. Then she paused, as if deciding how much to give him. "In your language, walks after rain. My family calls me that. My band calls me that. My mother gave me that name. Walks after rain," he said. She nodded once. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and looked into the fire. He wanted to ask how she'd ended up at his gate in a storm in the middle of the night. But he could see she was exhausted, and he'd lived long enough to know that some questions could wait. He got up and put more wood on the fire. He found a second blanket and put it on the floor near the hearth, away from the drafts, and set his spare pillow on top of it. "You can sleep there," he said. "I'll be in the back room. The door locks from the inside." She looked at the pallet. She looked at him. She said, "You are not afraid." "Of what?" "Of me." He thought about that honestly. "No," he said. "Are you afraid of me?" She considered this for a moment. "Yes," she said, "but less than the storm." That was how it started. In the morning the storm had passed and left the world scoured clean, everything gleaming and sharp under a cold blue sky. Cal rose at first light and went to the main room, and found her already awake, sitting by the dead fire, her blanket around her shoulders. She'd remade the pallet and folded both blankets with a precision that surprised him. The bowl she'd used was rinsed and sitting upside down on the edge of the hearth. He built the fire back up and made coffee and cornmeal mush and sliced cold salt pork. He set a plate across from his, and they ate in the same silence they'd slept in, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who understood that there were things to be said, but that the time for saying them had not arrived. After breakfast, she told him what had happened. She was Mescalero Apache, from a band that had been living in the Sacramento Mountains to the south, a small group that had not yet been pushed fully onto the reservation at Tularosa. 8 days before, a detachment of soldiers had moved through their camp demanding they relocate further east. When the men of the band refused, the soldiers had scattered them, not a massacre but a scattering. Horses driven off, supplies taken, the camp broken up into people running in different directions in the dark. She had run north. Her left foot had caught a rock in the dark and turned badly. She'd been moving through the high desert for 8 days, hiding in the day, walking at night, eating what she could find and sometimes not finding anything. She said this the way you describe something that happened to someone else. Cal listened and did not offer anything until she was done. "You can stay until your foot heals," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Why?" "Because you need to," he said. She didn't answer that. He wasn't sure he'd given her anything worth answering. But she didn't leave either. He had expected the town to have something to say about it, and it didn't take long. 3 days after the storm, Harlan Briggs from the adjacent property came by to check on flood damage to the shared fence line, and found Walks After Rain in the yard, splitting kindling with Cal's hatchet. She was very good at it. Harlan stood at the fence with his mouth open for a long moment, and then said, "Cal, what in the hell?" which was not exactly a question. Cal told him plainly. She'd been caught in the storm, she'd needed shelter, her foot was healing, she was working for her keep, and it was not Harlan's business. Harlan said it would be the whole town's business by Thursday. which was true. Cal said he'd cross that fence when he got to it. Harlan rode away looking like a man who had encountered something his categories could not accommodate. Walks After Rain had watched this exchange from 20 feet away, hands on the hatchet, saying nothing. When Harlan was gone, she looked at Cal. "You will have trouble," she said. "Probably," he said. "Because of me. Because of people who don't know you." She turned that over quietly. Then she went back to splitting kindling. She set the hatchet in exactly the same place she'd picked it up from, which was a habit of hers he'd noticed. She returned everything to where she found it. She watched how he moved through the space of the ranch, and matched his patterns with a careful precision that told him she'd learned to stay invisible in spaces where being visible was dangerous. He found himself watching that precision and feeling something complicated about it. The suspicion between them didn't disappear immediately. It lived in the small spaces of the day, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the way she kept the knife at her belt even when she was cooking, the way she never fully turned her back on him in those first days. He noticed all of it and gave it room. He knew what it was to have learned the hard way that the world wasn't safe. He didn't take it personally. What changed it, or began to change it, was the barn. The storm had taken 3 boards off the north wall of the barn and buckled 2 of the main roof braces. It needed proper repair before the next weather came through, and Cal was trying to figure out how to get the upper brace back into position without a second person holding it, when Walks After Rain appeared in the barn doorway. She looked at the problem for a moment, then walked in, positioned herself under the brace, and got her shoulders under it without being asked. They worked on the barn for 2 full days. She was stronger than she looked, and she understood structures intuitively, the way some people just do, looking at a joint and knowing before the nail went in whether it would hold. Cal had to explain very little. He would start a task and she would read where it was going and move to the right place before he directed her. By the end of the second day, they'd replaced the damaged boards, reinforced the brace, and rechinked 3 gaps in the east wall. Cal's shoulders ached in a way they hadn't in 2 years. The specific ache of work done with another person, work that required coordination and small adjustments, and the occasional brush of hands or shoulders in a tight space. He'd forgotten what that felt like. He hadn't realized he'd forgotten until he felt it again. That night he made a proper supper, not the basic rotation he'd been on for 2 years. He made a venison stew with dried chilies and onions and thyme from the last of Clara's kitchen garden, which had gone to half-weeds but still produced some herbs. He set the table. He put the bread in the center. Walks After Rain sat down and looked at the stew and then at him. "You cook well," she said. "My wife taught me," he said. And then the word wife sat in the room for a moment, and he didn't know what to do with it. "She died 2 years ago, her and our daughter both." Walks After Rain was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had a brother. He died last winter. He fell in the mountains. There was no one to go back for him in the snow." She stopped. "I still look for him when I wake up." That was the first time they traded grief. It wouldn't be the last. Over the following days, the knife at her belt came off during the afternoons. First just for an hour while she was working close to the fire, then for longer stretches. She started setting it on the shelf by the door when she came inside, picking it up again when she went out. It was not a dramatic thing. It was just a small daily movement that he tracked without meaning to, the way you track the small details of the life happening around you. She taught him words in Mescalero, not formally, not like a lesson, but incidentally, the way you name things when you're standing next to them. The word for fire was ko. The word for horse was je. She said them once and waited to see if he tried to repeat them, and when he did, badly, she corrected him without laughing, which he appreciated. He taught her the names of the tools he hadn't found words for in their conversations. The long iron rod he used to clear the chimney, the particular wrench for the pump housing, the difference between a draw knife and a spoke shave. She learned them efficiently, storing them the way she stored everything, with a precision that suggested she'd spent her life in an environment where knowing things correctly was the difference between managing and not. He showed her the kitchen garden, which had gone to weeds after Clara died. He'd been meaning to clear it for 2 years and hadn't found the motivation. They cleared it together over 3 mornings. walks after rain, working the rows with a focus that turned out to be partly practical. She could identify which plants she knew and which she didn't, and she started talking about plants in a way he'd never heard anyone talk about plants. She knew about the osha root, which grew in the nearby mountains and which her band used for respiratory ailments and to cleanse wounds. She knew about yerba santa, the sticky-leafed shrub that grew along the creek, which she called nande kesh, and which was good for chest complaints. She showed him a plant he'd been pulling as a weed, a low-growing thing with gray-green leaves, and told him it was used by her people to reduce fever. He said her mother had been the band's healer and had taught her most of what she knew about plants. "She's still alive?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I don't know where. We were separated." She said this without drama. The grief was in the word separated, not in any added weight she gave it. He thought about what it must have been like to have lost everyone in the dark, in the panic of a dispersed camp, and then to have walked alone for 8 days through country that would kill you without much effort. He thought she was one of the toughest people he'd ever met, and he'd met some tough people. He didn't say that. He just nodded and kept pulling weeds. She told him about the Mescalero way of moving through the Sacramento Mountains, the seasonal routes her band followed to stay near water and away from the army posts. She talked about the white sands to the south, which she called Sal Sepuedes, the great gleaming flat of gypsum that you could see from 30 miles away on a clear day, and how her band used the surrounding basin as winter range. She talked about the way the land changed at different elevations, the different plants at each level, the way the deer moved through it. She knew the country the way you know a house you grew up in, with a detailed practical intimacy that had nothing to do with admiring it, and everything to do with living in it. Cal had lived in New Mexico for 3 years, and he'd never known any of this. He'd known the road between his ranch and Cimarron and the pastures in between. He'd never known what was happening in the country around him, who'd been in it first, how they'd used it, what it meant to them. He started to understand, sitting next to Walks After Rain in the cleared kitchen garden with the October sun warm on both their backs, that he'd been living in this place without actually seeing it. The evenings changed. He built the fire, and she sat across from him, and sometimes she talked, and sometimes they both sat with the fire between them, and said nothing, which was not nothing at all. He started looking forward to the evenings in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything since Clara died. Not with urgency or hunger, but with a quiet, steady thing that arrived around sunset, and stayed. He noticed she'd started placing her empty mug next to his in the mornings, not on the opposite end of the table, just near. He noticed she'd started calling the horses by the names he used for them, which meant she'd been paying attention to him, talking to them. He noticed that when he laughed, which happened occasionally now, she watched the laugh with an expression he couldn't quite name, but didn't want to look away from. He didn't name any of this to himself. He was a man who'd been alone for 2 years, and who did not entirely trust his own reading of things. But it was there, whatever it was, building quietly in the days. Her foot healed well. The ligament had been badly stretched but not torn. By the 2nd week, she was walking without the limp. By the 3rd, she was moving at full speed. He noticed this and waited to see what she would do with it. She stayed. She didn't ask. She just kept being there, in the mornings and evenings and in between, and he kept not suggesting she leave, and that was how it went. Then, on a Tuesday in the 5th week, 3 men rode up to the ranch. Cal saw them from the paddock where he was working with one of the horses. 2 of the men were wearing civilian clothes. One had a badge. The badge man was the county sheriff, Dan Colwell, who Cal knew slightly, a pragmatic and careful man who'd been in office for 4 years. The other 2 Cal didn't know. One of them was big, square-shouldered, with the particular look of a man who'd decided he was owed things by the world. The other was younger and kept one hand near his belt. Cal walked to the fence and waited. Colwell did the talking. There'd been a complaint filed in town. Someone had reported that Cal was harboring a renegade Apache on his property. These 2 gentlemen, he said, gentlemen with a slight flatness that told Cal what he thought of them, were employed by a trading concern that claimed the Apache woman in question had stolen from their supply depot during the dispersal near the Sacramento Mountains. They wanted to take her back for questioning. Cal looked at the 2 men. They looked back at him. The big one's eyes were already moving past him toward the house. "She didn't steal anything," Cal said. That's for the trading company to determine, the big man said. He had a voice like gravel. No, Cal said, it's not. She's been on my property for 5 weeks. I can account for every hour of those 5 weeks. She arrived here half-starved with a bad foot, alone, in a storm. That's not a woman who's been raiding supply depots. She's Apache, the big man said, as if that finished it. She's a person, Cal said. Caldwell looked uncomfortable. He'd come because his job required him to follow up on complaints. Cal could see he didn't love what he'd come to do. Cal, Caldwell said, if she's here, I'm going to have to ask you to bring her out so these men can... No, Cal said again. He said it the same way he'd said the first one, not loud, not with heat, just the word. Solid, with nothing after it. The big man said something about how this could go differently, and what the law required, and Cal let that run out. He was looking at Caldwell, not at the 2 hired men. You want to bring a charge, Cal said to the sheriff. You bring one from the county court. You bring me a paper signed by a judge. You come back with that, and I'll talk to you. What you've got right now are 2 men whose employer wants to drag a woman back because they can, and that's not something I'm going to help with. Caldwell held his gaze for a moment. He was working something out. Then he gave the 2 hired men a look that was not quite apologetic and said they'd need to follow the legal process. The big man argued it for a minute. The younger one had gone very still in the way men go, still when they're thinking about whether the situation is worth what it might cost. He decided it wasn't. They turned their horses around. Before they did, the big man looked past Cal toward the house one more time, as if memorizing the layout, and then he left. Cal went back to the paddock. He stood with the horse for a while, his hand on the animal's neck. He was not shaking. He was something below shaking, a tightness through his chest and arms that he recognized as the body's delayed accounting for what the mind had been calm through. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Walks After Rain was standing at the paddock gate. She'd been in the barn, he realized. She'd heard everything. She was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, a kind of stillness that had something in it beyond calm. You knew it would cause you trouble, she said. The men who came? Yes. And you still said no. Yes. She was quiet for a long moment. The horse pushed its nose against Cal's shoulder, and he steadied it without looking away from her. No one has ever done that for me, she said. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. But he held her gaze. She looked down at her hands and then back up at him. The big man, she said. He will come back at night without the sheriff. Cal had been thinking the same thing. I know. Then you need to know something, she said. I am not someone who hides while someone else fights for me. She pulled back the edge of her blanket and showed him that she still had the knife. She also had a second one, smaller, that he hadn't known about. If they come, she said, we stand together. That was not a request. It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact said the same way she'd said I am cold on the night she arrived. The same flat, direct register that meant she'd decided something and the deciding was done. All right, Cal said. They came on a Thursday, 2 nights later, past midnight. Not the 3 who'd ridden up in daylight. 4 men, one of them the big square-shouldered one, coming in from the east side where the fence was lowest, moving quiet enough that Cal almost didn't hear them. What woke him was the horse in the far paddock, the gray mare who was the lightest sleeper of the 6, who gave one hard snort and then went silent in the way horses go silent when something has scared them badly enough to shut them up. Cal was at the window with the rifle before his eyes were fully adjusted. He saw movement near the barn, a dark shape that was too upright and too deliberate to be an animal. He heard Walks After Rain behind him before he saw her. She'd already moved from the main room to the east window, and she was watching the approach from a different angle than he had. She held up 3 fingers, then moved one to indicate the man near the barn, then pointed 2 fingers toward the north fence. She'd counted them from her window before he'd gotten his eyes clear. He nodded. The next 4 minutes were not clean or simple. The big man got close enough to the barn to try the door and found it latched from inside, which wasn't how Cal usually left it, and that was what changed his mind about the situation being simple. He said something low to the men with him. Cal opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch with the rifle and said very clearly that they were trespassing and that he'd fired at trespassers before and slept fine after. What happened next depended on whether the men thought he was bluffing. He was not bluffing. Two of them ran for their horses on the far side of the east fence immediately, which told him they'd come more for intimidation than for a direct confrontation. The big man held his ground for a moment, squaring up, trying to read the situation. He had one hand on his own pistol. Then the barn door opened behind him. Walks After Rain had gone through the interior of the barn, which had a back entrance on the east side that Cal had shown her weeks before while explaining the property layout. She'd moved through it in the dark, which she could do better than he could, and she'd come out behind the man without making a sound. She held the larger knife low and to one side, not raised, not threatening. She was simply there between the man and the horses he'd need to reach. The big man did the accounting very fast. 2 angles. A rifle from the front, a knife from behind, held by someone who clearly knew what they were doing with it. The 2 men who'd run had made the outcome clear enough. He took his hand off the pistol slowly. Cal said, "Get on your horses and go back to whoever hired you and tell them this property isn't worth the trouble. Because the next time you come onto it in the dark, I won't be talking first." The man went. They all went. The sound of hooves faded south, and then there was nothing but the night sounds again, the creek running, the wind in the junipers, the gray mare restless in the far paddock. Cal let out a breath. He stood on the porch for a long time, watching the dark. He heard Walks After Rain come around the side of the house. She stopped a few feet away, and they both looked out at the empty yard together. "They won't come back," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't think they will." "You were not afraid." "I was afraid the whole time," he said. She considered that. "That is what courage is," she said. "In my language, nile, to hold still when the fear is moving." He said the word back to her, badly, and she corrected him. The night of the confrontation changed something between them, though it was hard to say exactly what changed or how. It wasn't that one event had decided everything. It was more that it proved something that had been building for weeks, proved it in a language both of them understood, which was the language of what you did when things got hard and you could have chosen differently. She had stood in the dark barn, behind that man, knowing she was a Mescalero woman on a white rancher's property, with no legal standing and no protection beyond her own nerve and a knife. She'd stood there anyway. He had walked out onto the porch, already knowing those men might be the kind to shoot first and let the county sort it out, knowing that his choosing her was going to cost him something in this county for a long time. Knowing all of that, and going out anyway. They had both been afraid. They had both held still. That was the thing. In the weeks that followed, the town of Cimarron did what small towns do. People talked. Harlan Briggs stopped coming by. A deacon at the church said something at Sunday services that Cal didn't hear firsthand, but that reached him third-hand, and he decided he didn't need to hear it firsthand to understand his relationship to that church going forward. 2 ranchers he'd known since his first year in the territory crossed the street to avoid him once in town. He went to the general store and bought flour and nails and coffee, and talked to Frank Ortega behind the counter, who had always been square with him, and Frank was still square with him, which mattered. He brought home dried beans and a length of good wool fabric, the kind Walks After Rain had mentioned she could make into a proper dress for winter. He set it on the table without ceremony. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked at him, and the look had something in it that he'd been trying not to examine too closely for several weeks. There were evenings now where they talked for 2 hours, and then sat in silence for an hour after that, and neither of them wanted to move because the fire was warm and the silence was warm too. There were mornings where he'd hear her moving around the kitchen before he was up, and he'd lie there for a minute just listening to her in his house, which was the most alive his house had felt since Clara. He told Walks After Rain about Clara one evening, not just the facts of her death, but Clara herself, who she'd been, how she'd measured twice and cut once on everything, whether it was wood or decisions, how she'd grown up on a farm in Ohio and could fix a pump without looking at it twice, how she'd liked the desert even when it was hard, which it often was because she said things that required hard work were the only things that stayed. How she used to hum songs he didn't know the words to while she cooked, songs she'd learned from her mother. Walks after rain listened to all of this. When he was done, she said, "She sounds like someone who understood what things were worth." "She did," he said. "That is a rare thing," she said, "to know what things are worth." He looked at her across the fire. He had been working out something for weeks, and he had not been able to get it into a shape that made sense to say. He tried to find the words for it now. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the winter." She waited. "I'd like you to stay, through the winter and past it. I'm not asking because I need help with the ranch, though you're good at it. I'm asking because I don't want to go back to what this house was like before you were in it." She was very still. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the junipers with that dry whisper that meant it was cold and clear. "I need to find my mother," she said. "When the snow breaks in spring, I need to go south toward the Sacramento Mountains and find what's left of my band. I don't know who survived. I don't know where they are. I can't not go. I know," he said. "I'd go with you." She looked at him. "I've got 6 horses," he said. "Good ones. I know how to travel. I can't replace the people you've lost, and I wouldn't try. But 2 people move through hard country better than 1, and I'd rather go with you than sit here wondering how you're doing out there alone." She was quiet for a long time. He waited. He'd learned how to wait with her. "You would leave your ranch," she said. "Your land. I'd leave it in Frank Ortega's care for a few weeks. He's honest. The horses can travel with us, or he'd watch them. The herd's small enough." She looked into the fire. He could see something working through her face, something that was partly disbelief and partly something else, something more complicated. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that I would not find anyone who would choose to walk beside me, not because of anything I lacked, but because of what I am in this territory to most people who look at me." "You're not to me," he said. "No," she said. "You've been showing me that for a long time. I have been trying to understand what to do with it." She looked up from the fire and met his eyes. "In my culture, when a man and woman choose each other, there is a ceremony. It is done with the family present, with gifts, with the right people speaking the right words. I don't have my family here, but there is a simpler way, for when people are far from home, you face east together and you speak what you are choosing, and the earth and the sky are the witnesses." He held her gaze. "If I am to stay," she said, "I am to stay as someone who has been chosen and who has chosen, not as a woman taken in from the storm." "That's what I'm asking," he said. "I don't know how to say it the right way, but that's what I'm asking." She nodded slowly. It was not the nod of someone agreeing to something they were unsure of. It was the nod of someone who has thought something through for a long time and found that the thing is exactly what it appears to be. They went outside. The night was cold and absolutely clear, the kind of clear you get in the high desert in November when the air has been scoured by weeks of weather, and there is nothing between you and the stars. They stood on the east side of the house, facing the mountains, which were dark shapes against a sky so thick with stars it looked solid. She spoke first, in Mescalero, something he didn't have words for, but whose shape he understood. Then she translated. "I was scattered by the storm, and you were still. I came to your gate with nothing, and you gave without asking what it would cost. I choose to walk beside you," he said. "I've been living in this house like something that was waiting to stop. You didn't ask me to change, and I changed anyway. I'd like to keep changing. I choose to walk beside you." She reached over and took his hand. Her hand was work rough and warm, and she held it the way you hold something you've been meaning to pick up for a long time and are glad to finally have in your hand. They stood like that for a while, looking east at the mountains, their breath making small clouds in the November dark. The stars didn't move. The wind was still. The creek ran down through the property in the dark with its cold, steady sound, the same sound it had made before either of them arrived and would make long after. In the spring they rode south into the Sacramento Mountains, with 2 horses each, and enough supplies for a month. It took them 3 weeks to find the remnants of her band, 15 people who had made it to a canyon they'd used as winter shelter for generations, a place with a spring and good overhang, and enough forage to get through the cold months. Her mother was there, her mother's sister, 4 men she'd grown up beside, a group of children who ran to walks after rain and grabbed her around the waist in a knot of arms and voices. Cal held the horses and watched from a distance while she was absorbed back into her people. He did not try to rush that. He understood that what was happening in that canyon was something she'd been afraid she'd never get again, and he wanted her to have all of it. Her mother came to him eventually, a tall, straight woman in her late 50s, with walks after rain's eyes and a steadiness in her face that told Cal exactly where her daughter had learned that quality. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something to her daughter. Walks after rain translated, "She says you brought her daughter back. She says that is a debt that cannot be paid." "Tell her I didn't bring her anywhere," Cal said. "She brought herself, I just came with her." Walks after rain translated that. Her mother considered it. Then she said something short and turned back toward the camp. "What did she say?" he asked. "She said, 'Good. You know the difference.'" He smiled at that. It was the best thing anyone had said to him in years. They stayed in the Sacramento Mountains for 2 weeks, helping the band move to better forage as the spring warmed, helping repair the shelters, contributing what they had. On the last night before they rode north, there was a fire and food and people talking in a language he was just beginning to learn the edges of. He sat next to Walks After Rain and listened, and she translated the pieces she thought he'd need. And the pieces she didn't translate, he learned from the faces and the firelight and the way people sat together when they trust each other. He rode north to the ranch with her beside him, the same high plateau country, the same junipers and piñons, the same Sangre de Cristo peaks ahead. The kitchen garden needed clearing again. The barn needed new shingles on the east side. There was enough work for 2 people and no shortage of days. He looked over at her once, on the second day, as they were riding through a stretch of country she'd been describing to him for weeks. The basin she'd called Sal Si Puedes, the gleaming white flat of gypsum visible to the south. She was watching it the way people watch the places that made them, with a recognition that had nothing in it of wanting to be somewhere else. She turned and caught him looking. "You're still here," she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have turned around in Cimarron when those men came," she said. "You could have turned around a dozen times." "I could have," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back toward the mountains ahead and kept riding. Cal Danner was not the same man who'd sat in that house for 2 years in the quiet, waiting for nothing to change. He couldn't have told you the exact moment the change had happened, because it hadn't happened in an exact moment. It had happened the way the creek carved the rock it ran over, without announcing itself, by simply being consistent and present over a long time. He had opened a gate in a storm and taken in a woman with nothing but a bad foot and a bone-handled knife, and a name that meant she'd been born after the rain. And she had walked through that gate and changed nothing about who she was, because she'd had no reason to, and changed everything about who he was, because she had simply been there, steady and true, long enough for him to remember what it felt like to have someone to face east with. He'd needed that. He hadn't known how much until she showed him. The ranch waited for them at the end of the ride, the same board-by-board house he'd built with Clara, the same good well, the same pastures, the same mountains behind it, and the same sky. But it was not the same house he'd left. It never would be again. And that, in the end, was exactly what he'd needed it to be.